Hello Flame community, this is Jeff Kyle with the Flame Learning Channel. In the previous video on the Lens Distortion node for Flame 2025, we went over the basics of Lens Distortion and how to use the new node. And in this video, we'll be talking about some of the more advanced features: spline detection, integration with 3D equalizer, and some of the more advanced controls. We are back in batch, and I'll just quickly connect the Lens Distortion node to my source and to my lens grid. As we saw from the last video, the act of connecting the lens grid gives me the ability to hit the calculate button and move on. But let's talk a bit about some of the advanced detection settings. If we press F2 to look at the lens grid, we see the detection controls are no longer grayed out, and we can start to make some changes. I'll first enable show lines to give us a colored overlay on top of the image to indicate where Flame is seeing potential lines to use for calculating the distortion. I've found they're a little easier to see on a bright checkerboard like this if we lower the exposure of the image, so I'll quickly use the Shift-E keyboard shortcut so we can see what we're working with just a little better. Looking at the detection settings, we have some controls to adjust how the lines are detected. If you find the default settings are not quite displaying what you would expect them to, try to adjust these settings to create as many accurate lines as possible. The higher the threshold, the more picky the detection will be, and the lower the threshold, the more lenient it'll be. The detection settings under the Show Lines button update in real time and affect the line indicators shown on the screen, and the detection settings under the Convert to Splines button don't affect the lines, but will update the splines if there are any on the screen at the time. Once we have some lines that are looking representative of our grid, we can click the Convert to Splines button to take the detection analysis and turn them into usable splines. With these newly created splines, we can click on them in the viewport and modify them with the on-screen controls, or delete any splines we don't want with this button down here. If we don't have a lens grid, we can use the more manual approach of using the footage to create our own splines and calculate the lens distortion that way. I'll start fresh and pull out a new lens distortion node and only connect the front to my source media. Looking at the front view with F1, I can enable lines with the Show Lines button and adjust the settings to try to get the result that I'm looking for. When working with a lens distortion grid, there's a bit more leniency with the Show Lines detection because the only visible lines in the scene are probably going to be pretty good. Alternatively, when dealing with lines on regular footage, you do have to be a bit more careful that you aren't creating unwanted splines. For that reason, let's talk about generating our own splines. Similar to the legacy lens distortion workflow, we can add our own splines to use for the distortion calculation. To add a spline, we can use this Add Spline button here and start drawing our spline. We can also use the Space-G keyboard shortcut and then start drawing our splines. In the legacy Lens Distort workflow, we were limited to 3 points on our spline, but this spline can have as many points as we need. When we're done drawing, we can use the Finish button down here, use the Finish Spline keyboard shortcut Alt-F, or if we have more splines to draw, we can use the Space-G keyboard shortcut again to finish one spline and start the next. Once we have enough splines representative of the scene, we can click Calculate to calculate the distortion. If you're working closely with 3D equalizer in your pipeline, you have the option over here in the bottom left corner to import a 3D equalizer lens distortion file. Inside of 3D equalizer, you would choose the export option Export Lens Distortion to Autodesk Flame version 1.0, as of the recording of this video. And that will create a JSON file with all the necessary data that you can load to populate all the lens distortion control fields here inside of Flame. But be sure to note that in order to use this feature inside of 3D Equalizer, you will need to download a script from the 3D Equalizer website, for which the link will be in the description of this video. Moving on to some other controls, the focal length, focal distance, and controls area of the node is context specific based on the model you choose over here. For instance, when I have the default model chosen, these are the controls that are displayed. But when I switch the model to this anamorphic one, for example, we'll see the controls change and actually overflow into two separate tabs with all sorts of advanced lens distortion fields that we can fill out. Some of the fields here are only modifiable under certain circumstances. For example, the focal length controls are only modifiable when the fisheye model is selected, and the focus distance control cannot be set inside of Flame. It can only be imported from a 3D Equalizer data file. We can manually adjust these control fields to adjust the lens distortion. Adjusting each of these fields modifies some aspect of the lens distortion. But it's very important to note that this is a separate pathway compared to calculating the distortion based on detection. When we click the Calculate button, the control fields will be set based on the splines that were drawn or converted from the lines. If these controls have been manually adjusted, they will be ignored and changed when the calculation takes place. We can make slight adjustments to the controls after the calculation has taken place, but if we change them beforehand, they will be overridden. And finally, under Perspective, when enabling the Show Boxes field, a box appears with controls similar to the bilinear or perspective surfaces in action, giving us the ability to nudge either the vertices of the four corners or by switching the vertices to UVs to nudge the UVs. Putting aside minor and careful adjustments to the undistortion, it's possible to create some very quick and easy tile effects, but if you've gone a little too far like I have here, the reset button brings us right back to where we started. If you like these videos and you're finding them helpful, please subscribe to the Flame Learning channel and click the bell to stay notified about new content. Feel free to comment any questions or suggestions below. Until next time, thanks a bunch for watching.